Hello again, everybody. I thought I would show my face for this video. You know, I had a shower and everything, so it looked pretty good. Anyway, so in the last video, we talked about the female reproductive system and the production of an egg inside the ovary and the release of an egg, ovulation. And in this video, we're going to talk in more detail about the events leading up to ovulation and those events that take place after. And all of those cyclical changes that happen around the process of ovulation are called the menstrual cycle. And we're going to look at those changes that take place in the ovary, how the lining of the uterus changes during the menstrual cycle, how the hormones that regulate these changes play a role as well. So let's start off by looking big picture. Why do females have a menstrual cycle? What's the function? What's the purpose of having a menstrual cycle? And the purpose is really twofold. The menstrual cycle is responsible for producing a mature egg, one that's capable of fertilization, one that is potentially going to become an offspring, and releasing that egg into the reproductive tract. Because inside the ovary here, there's no way a sperm is going to get to it. So we have to release the egg. A female has to release the egg into the reproductive tract. And then the second big function of the menstrual cycle is to prepare the uterus, specifically the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, for an embryo if fertilization takes place. Because we are placental mammals, the embryo makes a very intimate connection with the mother and starts to take nourishment from the mother while it develops during pregnancy. And so the second major thing that happens is that the lining of the uterus is prepared for implantation when an embryo finds its way into the uterus. So in this diagram, which is showing a cross-section of an ovary, we see sort of the menstrual cycle happening in kind of a clockwise circle here from the primary follicle here on the top left. That would be something that starts developing right at the end of a menstrual period, which you might consider the beginning of the next menstrual cycle. And then the follicle grows, the egg matures, and then it is released into the uterine tube. That's ovulation. And then inside the ovary, what was left of the follicle changes into the corpus luteum. And that structure produces hormones, specifically the female sex steroids, estrogen and progesterone. And those two hormones are responsible for preparing the uterus, for stimulating the uterus to prepare for an embryo to implant. Here is a look at some of those same events that we saw in the ovary, now set out into a line, and juxtaposed with those ovarian events, things happening in the ovary, are things happening with hormones that come from the pituitary gland. Those are the gonadotropins. And the hormones that come from the ovary, estrogen and progesterone. So if we say that day 0, the beginning of a menstrual cycle, is the beginning of menstruation, a menstrual period, we can track these changes that take place in the lining of the uterus on the bottom with the hormones, estrogen, progesterone, LH, and FSH, and then with the ovary where we just tracked those changes on the previous slide. And what we see is that over the course of the menstrual cycle, the egg is maturing and being released by ovulation, at the same time that the uterine lining is starting to get thick and it is starting to fill with blood vessels. And it takes about a week for an ovulated egg to move through the uterine tube, the fallopian tube, and reach the uterus. So at about day 21 of this cycle, when the lining of the uterus is sort of at its maximum thickness and vascularization, blood vessels, that's when a potential embryo might reach the uterus and might be looking for a place to implant and to start taking nourishment from the mother. If that embryo does not arrive, if fertilization didn't take place, then the cycle would start over again, and we would have menstruation begin, and another cycle would start up. And then the whole process repeats itself. Produce an egg, prepare the lining. If fertilization takes place, then pregnancy can occur. If fertilization doesn't take place, then we're sort of cleaning house and starting over again. Just a couple of quick notes. There's this big bump in the hormone LH, that's a hormone from our pituitary gland, that is the direct stimulus for ovulation. It is this burst, this great jump in luteinizing hormone, LH concentration, that causes ovulation. And then we see the increasing estrogen during the first part of the cycle, coinciding with the lining of the uterus becoming thicker. And then relatively high concentrations of estrogen and much higher progesterone being associated with an even greater thickening of the lining of the uterus and more blood vessels. So all of that's happening to prepare the uterus for the possibility that an embryo is going to show up and need a place to implant. Okay, we spoke before when we saw a picture of a sperm cell close up that there is a covering on the head of the sperm called the acrosome. And I said we'll see that later. And here we are again with the moment when a sperm cell meets an egg. So this is something that would typically take place between 12 and 48 hours after ovulation has taken place, maybe up to 3 days after ovulation has taken place, but it's usually within a couple of days of ovulation. And if there are sperm in the female reproductive tract at this time, this can happen. A sperm can meet an egg. And we pointed out in a previous video that eggs are covered by this protein coating called the zona pellucida. So this is the egg cell down here, the ovum, and the sperm would have to fuse with the membrane of the egg cell if fertilization is going to take place. And that can't happen because the egg is covered with this zona pellucida. And this is where the acrosome comes in. That is basically a little baggie filled with digestive enzymes, the acrosome is. And if it meets an egg, the contact with the cells on the surface of the egg, these cells that are called the corona radiata, that will stimulate the acrosome to break down and release those digestive enzymes. The protein wall of the zona pellucida will be digested, and the sperm cell can get to the egg and fertilize it. So here is what those early days might look like if an egg is released and fertilized. As I said, the egg will be sort of captured by the fimbria of the uterine tube, the fallopian tube, and will be drawn into the uterine tube. And it is usually within the first day or so after ovulation that if the egg is going to be fertilized, it will be fertilized in this region of the uterine tube, and it will continue to travel down the uterine tube toward the uterus. And while that's happening, the fertilized egg will divide again and again to create a embryo that has more and more cells, but really hasn't grown very much at all until it reaches this stage in the uterus. And then it does start to grow a little bit. But this cluster of cells, it's called a morula. Morula means mulberry. And this cluster of cells called the morula is really no bigger than the egg was on its own. So now we have the embryo about 7 to 10 days after the egg was ovulated, reaching the uterus. And remember that very soon, if the woman's body is not getting a signal that there is an embryo there, very soon the lining of the uterus will be shed and a new menstrual period will happen. So it is of the utmost importance to this embryo to get a signal to the mother that the egg has been fertilized and that there's an embryo present. A couple of interesting sort of evolutionary sidetracks. This early stage of embryonic development is almost identical in all animals. Even at animals as unbelievably different from humans as a sea urchin, this early stage of embryonic development looks almost the same. And if we look at later embryonic development, we see other striking similarities. So in this diagram, you see pictures of a variety of different vertebrate animals. Fish, salamander, which is an amphibian, a tortoise, chicken, pig, cow, rabbit, and human. And at the very early stages, all vertebrate embryos look very, very similar. And this idea that we have similar structures, and we believe it's based on a common ancestry based on evolution, we call this kind of similarity homology. And there is striking embryo homology across all vertebrate animals. And then as the animal starts to develop more and more, it starts to take on greater similarity to the adult version of that animal and ultimately its final form. Here is a short time later. We see the embryo has developed into what looks like one of these very early stage vertebrate embryos now. And it's surrounded by a couple of membranes, the amnion and the chorion. And there's a third membrane associated with embryonic development, and it's the yolk sac. And yep, it's that kind of yolk sac, the same kind of yolk sac that our bird and reptile relatives have inside of an egg. And the yolk sac later on in development plays no role, but at this very early stage, it collects some of the waste that the embryo produces. But very soon, the embryo will start dumping those wastes into the placenta so that the mother's body and the mother's excretory system can take care of it. So at this very early stage, we start to see blood vessels growing out from the embryo into the lining of the uterus, blood vessels from the mother starting to grow towards those fetal or embryonic blood vessels, and the beginnings of the placenta starting to form. And here's a close-up of that placenta, a most amazing organ, a uniquely mammalian organ. The placenta is this amazing combination of tissues from the fetus and tissues from the mother working together to form this functional exchange structure between the mother and the baby. And I think I wrote some good notes here, so I'm going to let you pause the video and read my notes. And if you have any questions or any concerns about this, bring those to class with you. So pause now and read my notes. Did you pause and read the notes? Besides exchanging nutrients and waste with the baby, the other major function of the placenta is to secrete hormones. In fact, the placenta is almost completely responsible for secreting all the, the hormones that will maintain a pregnancy. You can remove the ovaries from a mammal after the first third of the pregnancy is over and the placenta is mature. You can remove the ovaries from a pregnant mammal and the pregnancy will continue as normal. That's how important the placenta becomes in terms of making hormones. Okay, the two hormones that are most important for maintaining the pregnancy are the steroid hormones, progesterone and estrogen. And this chorionic gonadotropin, HCG for human chorionic gonadotropin, I mentioned a minute ago that it was really essential for the embryo to get a signal across to the mother that, hey, there's an embryo here, don't have a menstrual period, or else I'm dead. And that signal comes in the form of this hormone called chorionic gonadotropin. The embryo produces that hormone in massive quantities for such a tiny structure during the first week to 2 weeks of the embryo's life, and some of that hormone will cross over into the maternal circulation, and that signal basically is transmitted to the mother's body to maintain the lining of the uterus and to not allow a menstrual period to take place.